Very good afternoon to all. I'm Laura Natale, Tech, Media, Telecom and Mobility Director at the Centre on Regulation in Europe, CERRE, welcoming you all and facilitating our launch event on co-investment and network sharing at the occasion of publishing an issue paper, the paper itself being called Cooperation Between Telecommunications Operators for Infrastructure Deployment. We have 90 minutes today, and the paper's author is one of CERRE's academic co-directors, Professor Marc Bourreau, who also co-authored the lengthier research report on the same topic called Implementing Co-Investment and Network Sharing. This published back in May 2020, and Marc will present how he laid out his update on the issue here, and it's a way of update, noting, of course, the many changes in context over the last year and a half. Following Marc's presentation of his work, we then have a fantastic academic and institutional panel comprising an external academic voice, the European Parliament, European Commission and body of EU regulators. I will introduce all these representatives after Marc's presentation. You'll be more than welcome to ask each and every one of them questions under the hashtag CERRE-Telco on our Slido, which you'll find on the screen. And I will start taking these questions after each speaker has had the chance to react to the paper in the first instance. Now, CERRE had an bumper week last week with many events and launches. These included questioning the concept of platform size harms, also the chips crunch, where we heard from Commissioner Breton. And at the core of both those issues is the resilience of connectivity infrastructure, which is central and which in February this year, telco CEOs also debated with us here at CERRE. There's, of course, European vision for a green digital future, making Europe fit for the digital age. And this has been prominent also within annual State of the Union speeches by the President of the European Commission. And how investment in connectivity happens is, of course, going to be crucial to making that vision a reality. Today, then, we can look more at co-investment at a pan-European level, and it's important to do so, we believe, and go beyond examples from any particular national market, as Marc will explain. So promptly, let's hear from Marc, who will tell us more on this issue. Very good afternoon to you, Marc. Congratulations on your paper, and I'll give the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Lara, for this introduction. So the cooperation for infrastructure deployment is a very important phenomenon today in the telecom sector in Europe, which justifies this event today. And the objective of the issue paper that we published today at CERRE is to highlight the benefits that we can expect from cooperation in infrastructure deployment, the possible concerns that may arise, and how they can be handled. So next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so digital connectivity plays a key role to improve productivity and to foster innovation in all the sectors of the economy. And this is particularly important today in the recovery phase of the COVID-19 crisis. However, significant investment is required to deploy the new digital infrastructure capable of providing widespread connectivity to the economy. But deploying such infrastructure has become increasingly challenging for operators. Whereas the legacy networks which were deployed in the past, such as the copper fixed network or the third generations of mobile networks, were rolled out under monopoly before liberalization of the market or duopoly just after it. Today, operators face strong competition both within the sector and beyond with over-the-top players. Since appropriation of the benefits and gains of innovation and new investment is limited by this competitive environment, infrastructure sharing has become an important means for operators to reduce their costs and therefore to improve the business case for the deployment of new infrastructure. From a public perspective, a public policy perspective, cooperation between competitors may involve some trade-offs. So on the one hand, cooperation allows firms and here operators to reduce risks and share costs, improving their ability to invest and to innovate, which is pro-competitive. But on the other hand, there is also the concern, for example, that cooperation may harm competition by facilitating some form of collusion between firms that are partnering for a project like infrastructure deployment, which could weaken their incentive to invest. So in this presentation, what I'm going to do is to discuss the possible pro-competitive and anti-competitive effects of infrastructure sharing based on the relevant economic literature and the previous research that we did last year at CERRE on the implementation of these kind of agreements and also the legislative issues related to infrastructure sharing. So next slide, please. So let me start with some definitions and some general observations. So infrastructure sharing occurs when two or more operators share a network infrastructure and thus the cost associated with it. For fixed networks, it corresponds to what is called co-investment, and for mobile networks, it corresponds to network sharing. I will talk in both cases of infrastructure sharing, even though there are important differences between mobile and fixed sharing, as I will make clear during the presentation. Infrastructure sharing can occur in different degrees, depending on the scope, geographic scope of the cooperation between the firms or the network elements shared by the firms. So first, firm may share only passive network elements, such as ducts for fixed networks or sites for mobile networks, but they can also share active network elements, that is electronic network elements, such as a radio access network for a mobile network, or even the whole network altogether. And obviously, a higher degree of sharing is going to lead to higher cost savings for the firms and possibly to higher benefits. But at the same time, it can also increase the competition concerns that we may have with this kind of cooperative agreement. Sharing can occur ex ante before investments are made, or it can occur ex post after they have been realized. And for fixed networks, sharing typically occurs ex ante, whereas for mobile networks, it can occur either ex ante or ex post. So obviously, this kind of agreement is going to influence investment incentives more if they occur ex ante than ex post. But the possibility to share infrastructure ex post may also lead to opportunistic behavior from the potential co-investors, because they can wait for all uncertainties to be realized before engaging into an agreement. And this is the kind of concern that we may have with fixed co-investment when it occurs late, so the so-called late co-investment problem. So in Europe, we observe typically two main sorts of infrastructure sharing agreements, so cooperative arrangements and contractual arrangements. So with cooperative arrangements, partners create a common entity to manage the rollout of the infrastructure and then to maintain and operate the network. With a contractual arrangement, there is one operator that invests in an infrastructure and then provides access to it to third parties, either through reciprocal access or one-way access. And so what's the difference between the two? So typically, cooperative arrangements are going to lead to larger synergies between the partners, but they require stronger commitment from the partners to be realized. And finally, this kind of sharing agreements can be mandated or they can be market-driven. When they are market-driven, what motivates firms to engage in infrastructure sharing is this possibility to reduce costs that I talked about already. Finally, so in this category, so there is this new provision in the code, in the new code, Article 76, where co-investment is viewed as a substitute for SMP access regulation. So co-investment in the code is market-driven in the sense that firms take the initiative to propose a co-investment agreement under this article, but it can lead to complete deregulation under some conditions. So next slide, please. Okay. So you see two pictures in this slide which show you the status of mobile sharing and fixed sharing in the EU as of today, more or less. So it's not the same data exactly on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, but nonetheless, it's relatively accurate picture of the status of co-investment and network sharing today. So in mobile markets, passive sharing of mobile sites and mobile masts is something very widespread. It is even mandated actually in some countries for environmental reasons. A recent trend for passive sharing is this possibility to spin out tower assets into so-called tower cos, which then have the incentive to share the passive infrastructure to third parties in a neutral way. Active mobile sharing is also common in many countries, as the figure shows. So on this figure, you see countries where it does not exist. These are the countries with the light green color on the picture, where there is no active sharing agreement or only on a very limited scale. So most active sharing agreements are based on commercial negotiations between operators and are not the result actually of regulatory obligations. So in the fixed market, co-investment is a more recent phenomenon. In some countries like France, it is actually mandated by the regulation. In most of the other countries like Portugal or Spain, for example, it is market driven. We also observe interesting agreements, co-investment agreements between telcos and utilities in some countries, such as Germany, and between telcos and equity funds in the Netherlands, for example. Italy is the first country where a co-investment agreement, co-investment offer has been made under Article 76 of the new code by the incumbent operator team through its subsidiary FiberCop. So next slide, please. So infrastructure sharing implies cost reductions between partner firms, as I already said, and for this reason, it may have pro-competitive effects through two main channels. First, infrastructure sharing can reduce the fixed cost, so CapEx, of deploying or upgrading a network, and this can translate then into higher investment. In telecom, investment can take two forms. So it can mean increased network coverage, or it can mean increased quality of the network. So when it means increased coverage, so this type of investment is particularly relevant for fixed networks, for example, when operators deploy fiber networks. But it may also be relevant when operators deploy a new generation of mobile networks, such as a 5G network. Investment in network quality now allows operators to offer a better quality of service to their consumers, for example, higher data speeds. Here, this is mostly relevant, I think, for mobile networks, where a higher network quality can be obtained by densifying the network. Besides, so firms can also reduce the variable costs, so the OPEX, of maintaining and operating a network. So consumers are going to benefit from these cost reductions if they are passed through in terms of lower prices, which is going to depend on the degree of competition in the marketplace. And in turn, what is interesting also, I think, to note is that the decrease in prices, so if it occurs, can influence operators' investment incentives. So I think most importantly, the magnitude of the gains that can be obtained from an infrastructure sharing agreement are going to depend on the counterfactual situation. That is, how would the market look without this infrastructure sharing agreement? The first question to be asked concerns the market structure in the absence of this agreement. So in particular, would investment materialize without the agreement or not? So this is the first question to ask. And there is a second question, which is about what kind of access obligations would apply to an infrastructure that would be deployed without the agreement in case there is no agreement, so in the counterfactual. And regarding this second question, so in the fixed markets, there would be typically an access obligation if the operator has significant market power, that is, it is an SMP operator. In the mobile market, by contrast, the counterfactual would typically not involve any access obligations. So notwithstanding, so by and large, infrastructure sharing will tend to lower prices and increase investment, or at least this is what the relevant literature predicts. But I think the magnitude of the gains are going to depend on the counterfactual. So prices are going to decrease because sharing yields synergies that can be passed through to consumers in terms of lower prices, or it is because the implicit access price within the agreement is equal to marginal cost and thus lower than a standard access price in the counterfactual situation. So investment in coverage tends to increase because operators can share the fixed cost of deployment. And so lower cost of deployment means wider coverage. Investment in quality, now the second type of investment, tends to increase also because the reduction in prices increases investment incentives. Next slide, please. So as discussed at the beginning of this talk, infrastructure sharing may involve trade-offs. It has pro-competitive effects, as we just discussed, but it may also have anti-competitive effects. So a first concern that we may have with this kind of agreement is that the partners may have the ability or the incentive to raise internal or external access prices to soften competition in the retail market by to their benefit, to increase their profits. And one way to deal with this kind of concern would be to introduce a regulatory oversight of access prices to ensure that they are not too high and so they don't lead to this kind of negative outcome. Second concern with this kind of agreement is that partners may have a limited ability or incentive to engage into unilateral investment and to differentiate via investment from their partners, which would reduce competition, and in particular, infrastructure-based competition, which is the preferred type of competition in the telecom sector. So here, the way to deal with this problem is to ensure that the independence of each partner in the agreement is guaranteed. So for example, it is important, I think, that each partner keeps the right to invest unilaterally outside of the sharing agreement, which is something that could be checked by looking at the agreement. A third concern is that third-party operators could be excluded through entry-deterring access conditions. That is, foreclosure could happen. And this would be particularly a problem if the agreement provides a strong competitive advantage to the partners. Indeed, in this case, the competition between the partners and the non-partner firms would be weakened to the detriment of consumers. And this problem here can be dealt with by ensuring that there are fair and reasonable wholesale access conditions to the joint infrastructure, and by limiting the exclusivity of the agreement, if any, to the minimum necessary. And finally, there is a standard concern that cooperation can favor explicit or tacit collusion between operators. And there are standard remedies to this problem. So the independence of the partner should be guaranteed. Information exchange should be limited to the minimum necessary. And there are different ways to do that. So one way to do that would be to require partner firms to assign clean teams to the common entity. Note that these remedies could be introduced by the firms themselves to avoid any anti-competitive concerns, or required by a regulatory authority if they are not already in the agreement. And finally, so in Article 76 of the new code, where co-investment is considered, it's interesting to note that the main concern, I think, is foreclosure. There are several conditions that are required to lift other regulatory obligations when operator offers co-investment under Article 76, and they are mainly meant to mitigate this risk of foreclosure. But I think the other concerns are less present, at least in the code. So this is all, and thank you a lot for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Marc. Very thorough, and in my view, clearly explained overview as well, which I certainly personally plan to keep as a reference point for accessible explanations. But also you raised some very important scenarios, and looking forward to coming back to many of these themes and forecasts around infrastructure sharing, both agreements and counterfactuals with our panelists shortly. Marc, you of course point to the relevant Article 76 of the code, the European Electronic Communications Code, as the Telecom Single Market Regulation, as the legal basis for codifying co-investment and its main issues around foreclosure. And I'm very pleased to say that we can now play you an interview that I conducted with a member of European Parliament, Pilar del Castillo, who of course was rapporteur of the code under the last mandate. And as Ms. del Castillo unfortunately could not be with us today, we recorded this session where we explore questions very much in the same vein to what we'll be looking at with the panel subsequently. So let's indeed start with the European Parliament view, and we can now play you video. Ms. del Castillo, thank you so much for taking the time to take part in our co-investment debate at the occasion of our issue paper launch. It's really an honor to have your contribution to the conversation, noting your long-standing leadership role covering telecoms issues in the European Parliament, and of course following on from your rapporteurship of the European Electronic Communications Code, or the Code as it's known. So if I may take us back to 2018 and the preceding negotiations, could you give us a bit more colour on why we adopted the Code?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor for me as well participate in this meeting. The code, I have to say, was designed to take into account changes in markets, consumer trends, and technology, all of which, as we know, have significantly changed since 2009, when the framework was last amended. In this regard, the code's provisions include measures to stimulate investment in very high-capacity networks, such as the co-investment model, but also new spectrum rules for mobile connectivity and 5G, as well as the universal service regime, end-user protection, and numbering and emergency communications rules. So that was the main the main, I would say, objectives and the main explanation why the code was adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. del Castillo. And if we think of the role then of co-investment as an instrument to achieve deployment of very high capacity networks, do you have any thoughts on that since the adoption of the code?
Well, the co-investment provision was designed to be an important tool that would foster very high capacity network rollouts. That's the beginning. We must not forget that regarding network deployments, public administrations only have a leverage effect to play, and investments will come primarily from the private sector. Proof of this is that member states appear to be investing the lowest amounts of recovery funds in network deployments. So we not have to forget this, because it's a clear proof of what I am saying. In this context, it's more important than ever that we give the appropriate investment-friendly signals to the private sector. For starters, we need to ensure that electronic communications code is implemented throughout the EU. An obligation, I must remember, that today some member states have not complied with. The code, I want to underline in a strong way that the code does not create co-investment. It codifies it, which is a different thing. In fact, co-investment agreements are a reality in some countries previously to the code. For example, in France, in urban areas and sub-urban areas, operators are obliged by existing regulations to open to potential co-investors any new fiber infrastructure that they want to roll out. In Portugal, similar situation. It is true that the regulator has not set up similar obligations that in France, but Vodafone and NOS struck a commercial co-investment deal to share dark fiber for around 2.6 million homes. And co-investment agreements have also taken place in Italy, Spain, and Switzerland. What the code does, it make this model available throughout the entire single market, increasing legal certainty to operators at the same time, and providing sufficient safeguards to ensure that competition is not hampered. In some countries, there is some debates on if it's hampering competition, it's not being applied well, and this and that. And what I want to say is that it's not for the legislator of any political body to assess whether a certain agreement harms competition. This job relies on independent regulators. And I want to stress this because this is a key principle of a healthy, competitive market. The code has enough provisions in order for the national regulatory authorities to intervene, to evaluate all these areas, because they are the ones that know best their national market. And in addition, Vera can play an advisory role, and after that, on the top of that, the Commission will monitor the market and ensure competition. But it is not for the legislator or any political body to assess whether this, as I said, agreement harms competition. That's important because sometimes there is misinformation, misunderstanding, and I think this is really important to stress. And also, all the markets has to be studied case by case. You cannot apply patterns to all the markets altogether. All national markets are different, and so also has to be taken into account. And it is, defined like that, considered like that, made explicit like that in the own code.
Maybe as a final thought, could we just come back to what, in your view, is the very essence of the code and in the context of connectivity in the bigger picture?
Well, in that context and the previous context as well, but in this context we are now even more, is connectivity. I think one of the main lessons of the pandemic in terms of digitalization is that, we can say that the pandemic has acted as kind of big lens, which showed to what extent digitalization is a must, and we have to move up a gear in Europe. And in that context, connectivity is the key aspect. Connectivity is a precondition for Europe to become part of a gigabyte society. Physical infrastructure is the foundation that will support the digital decade priorities. Clearly, I must say the deployment of very high capacity networks and 5G will open new ways of working in all areas, fostering increased productivity and completely new user experiences. Even to the extent, I must say that very high capacity networks will allow Europe to take a quantitative leap, benefiting an entire ecosystem, indeed, of technologies. And for all these reasons, the main objective of the code, the essence, the core of the code, I must say, is to harness all of this potential by boosting investment in very high capacity networks and 5G deployments, and through a regulatory framework that stimulates. I think all in all, this is the summary on why the codes.
Ms. del Castillo, thank you so much for your contributions. Great to end on the core essence of why we're focusing on co-investment. Very best wishes in your ongoing endeavours with the implementation of the code and beyond, and hope to talk to you again at future CERRE debate. Excellent. You see, Ms. del Castillo left us with so much content, many themes to discuss, and indeed some views and main messages that are certainly open to be debated. So it's definitely time to finally introduce the rest of our panel. We welcome Michel van Belleghem, currently chairing the EU network of telecoms regulators BEREC on behalf of the Belgian regulator BIPT. So welcome, Michel. It's great to have you with us today. We also have Rita Wezenbeek, Director of Connectivity, Communications Networks, Content and Technology at DG Connect in the European Commission. Good afternoon, Rita.
Good afternoon.
Yes, thank you so much, and great to have you back on this issue. As you know, I know you also spoke at the occasion of the wider study last year. And we also have with us Kayo Ekun, Professor of Economics and Deputy Director of the Centre for Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia. Good afternoon, Kai. And of course, Marc stays with us and is available to answer your questions. The Slido, as you'll see on your screen, is now open under the hashtag CERRE, and I will take your questions whenever appropriate during the discussion, and we very much look forward to your participation. So, distinguished panel, to start with, I would, of course, like to understand your views on what you've just heard. Marc's paper, and appreciating, of course, that as an issue paper, it's very much a pedagogic and instructive tool rather than focused on making a gamut of new recommendations necessarily. And after your first reactions, very much like in the interview we just heard, we can zoom out and look at the role of co-investment, both within the context of the code, within the context of wider VHCN deployment in its broader sense, and absolutely the wider economic context and European level initiatives, many of which Pilar del Castillo outlined in her interview towards the end there. So, with your academic and economist hat on, why don't we kick off with you on reactions to the paper?
Absolutely. Let me, before I say anything, kind of clarify that I've been working on this topic, advising TIM on their co-investment proposal in the past, so keep that in mind on my comments, although I hope there are economist comments as they usually occur. Let me make just a couple of comments. I think one on the basic approach that the paper is taking, and maybe at the end also a comment on what Pilar del Castillo said about the interaction between competition policy and regulation, because I think in the context of what I say, that's an important aspect of this as well. I appreciate the way that the paper kind of approaches this issue and tries to unify things, namely the issues of cooperation of fixed network providers and those of mobile network providers. I think it's really important to make these distinctions and make these distinctions concrete in terms of talking about the policy implications. And I think that would be kind of the main reason why I have some difficulties with a policy paper as it stands now. There is, of course, and this is kind of just like a general proposition in economics, if firms come together and reduce their costs, be it fixed costs or be it marginal costs, that is going to be beneficial to them. And typically it's also a Pareto improvement in terms of also improving the conditions for customers. That's in particular the case if the cost reduction is on marginal costs and not just on the fixed costs. So this is something, I think it's an important point because it's very much underappreciated, but some of the literature that Marc has cited kind of replicate that result in certain ways. For example, I'm thinking about the Motta and Tarantino paper, but it's really a very, very general proposition that we also have in information exchange in other contexts. So I think then the question really is, in terms of designing policy, in what kind of cost reductions we're really talking about. And I think this is the point in which I would wish the paper to be a bit more concrete, because I think a lot of the policy consequences follow out of the types of issues that we're looking at concretely. And I think this is probably also where fixed and mobile a little bit different, and where I think Marc has also mentioned that probably on the fixed side, the ex ante agreements are much more important, while on the mobile side, the ex post agreements are much more important. Why is that the case? I think on the fixed side, what is really impacting what we're calling very generally fixed costs, the question of uncertainty and demand that impacts the perceived expected costs of investment or the expected returns to investment. And I think that is one of the major motivating factors behind codifying co-investments in that context, in this context of fixed. And I think that's really important to make clear also in order to assess what kind of contracts are important in order to have successful co-investment agreements. So for example, what's important in co-investment very often is that there are a number of firms that might even have difficulties ex ante to put up money to put into co-investments, but that can very well commit to certain degrees of taking capacity ex post if they're being compensated for the risk that they're taking and taking up from others. And that is then going to very much determine what the structure of a co-investment agreement is, which may be even a mixed structure of joint ventures and contracts, in which kind of the contractual part is really one of those commitments that is taking off risk from the main driver of the offer of the co-investment agreement. Now we know that strong risk is something that holds back investments. So our interest in this area is in particular that we're speeding up the process of investments, that we're broadening it as much as possible. And that does not just mean broadening of bringing fiber everywhere, but it also means that we're broadening the range of areas in which it is worthwhile to invest into a second network in order to get the infrastructure competition that we want. And therefore, the type of kind of the types of co-investment agreements that are important there are specifically in terms of the risk reduction, I think. Let me say a couple of things, and I think I have more to say after we've heard from Marc on these. But if we're thinking kind of about these trade-offs between what should we be doing in order to get the investment going, but on the other hand, what are the competition, anti-competitive effects potentially? Marc was talking about both unilateral and coordinated effects. There, I'm kind of much less concerned about coordinated effects because they're not specific in any way to the particular conditions of co-investment agreements. Kind of in any type of context, you might be concerned about information exchange, for example. I think that concern is by now far overblown because what research that I've also contributed to has really shown that by themselves that there is not that much of an impact. It's really the question of, is pricing behavior coordinated or not? and how is it coordinating, and do we have safeguards against that? Just that you have a co-investment agreement doesn't really mean that you're cooperating on pricing and that there are any mechanisms to do so. So I think the compliance in that area is much more like in other areas. What's more important are the unilateral effects, and I think there it would really be helpful to structure the discussion more according kind of to the issues that people are interested in, namely the infrastructure competition and the competition on the network that we want to see. But also a third issue that I was missing, namely the question of ex post holdup, which I think in competition cases has been something that we've been concerned about. Let me make then the third point on the question of, should we basically say we have a regulation here and set something up that works according to the regulation, and maybe there could be competition problems, but that should be taken care of competition regulators. I think that's in particular a problematic approach as such when it comes in this type of context, because what a competition regulator is going to do under these circumstances is actually quite uncertain. The things that competition regulators have done have varied in this context. And I think the uncertainty that just comes in through the regulatory uncertainty of what decisions are going to be in a context in which you actually want to have investments going up fast is exactly the type of thing that you don't want. So I think what's really important in this context is to have very clear guidance as to the type of things that one should be avoiding in order not to lead to competition problems. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on when we get to the Vera guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayuwe. And we will definitely come back to many of the points you raised. Marc is, of course, here and may also respond to these. Moving on for now, Rita, hello. And with your experience, of course, on the enforcement side of co-investment and both within DG Competition and now DG Connect, of course, how have you received Marc's update paper?
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and also for inviting me again. Indeed, it is quite interesting to now look at this from another perspective. I've been earlier speaking from the perspective of DG Competition, and now it's DG Connect. So indeed, well, I appreciated Marc's paper also because it's high level, and in that sense, I think it comes to a like sublimation also of the earlier papers, and also comes to the essence, I think, of the elements that should go into the scale when you're weighing the pros and cons of co-investment and network sharing. Maybe I can perhaps address this from two perspectives. One is the wider background, where I think it's still perhaps helpful, although I saw Pilar del Castillo also refer to that, to paint a bit what is the current vision with which we address this issue of gigabit connectivity, and then to go a bit more in depth on the regulatory context of co-investment and network sharing. So this wider context, I think it's good to mention also here now that the way that we look at that is very much from the recent announcement of the policy program, The Path to the Digital Decade. So the history of that is that, as already signaled, the pandemic has shown us how dependent we are of digital infrastructures, and also how important they are for prosperity, welfare of the European citizens and businesses. So that has led to, first of all, a digital decade communication by the Commission in March this year. And as recently announced by the President of the Commission, the policy program Path to the Digital Decade that we are currently negotiating with Council and Parliament. And essentially that comes with a vision on where we want to land in 2030. And this vision is very human-centered and looking at technology needing to serve people. And also saying we want to identify values and principles with which we are using the digital environment. And if we want those European values and principles to offer the digital environment to European citizens, it is important that we own our technology, or at least are in a position that we can influence which standards apply to us. So this is why we have identified targets where we want to land in 2030. And these targets circle among 4 areas, but infrastructure in the wider sense, but including also gigabit connectivity is one of those areas. And we have also proposed now a governance program in which we will work together with the member states, European institutions and member states in a very close collaboration to make these targets work, to realize them. And we want to work together also in incorporating multi-country projects so that we have projects that are set up by more than hopefully 3 member states. And one of those projects that is mentioned is, for instance, that of cross-border corridors, where you could already, in the theme of today, also see cooperations with respect to network sharing, for instance, on a cross-border basis, to make the 5G corridors work for, let's say, self-driving cars. So that's the wider environment. Then where are we with respect to gigabit connectivity and co-investment? Well, what the targets for gigabit connectivity are that we want to reach in 2030 gigabit connectivity networks for all households and businesses, and we want to reach 5G networks for all populated areas. So how do we get there? And I'm grateful to Pilar for already signaling that. It is, of course, always with a mix of private and public investment. And I'm happy to signal that in private investment, we see a lot of positive and varied developments in the sense that the landscape is becoming much more diverse. So we see much more different financing models. For instance, the upcoming of tower companies, which are also often joint ventures. We also see concepts as wholesale-only companies, and we see new investors entering into the market, sometimes also independent infrastructure companies, but also, for instance, pension funds who have a long horizon and are ready to invest also in telecoms infrastructure. So positive, but also, of course, always leaving a gap for the areas that are more difficult to finance, and that then requires also EU or national funding. Now, with respect to co-investment, we see co-investment and network sharing as having a very important role in our, let's say, trajectory to reach this gigabit connectivity targets. So this is also why, as Pilar already welcomely signaled, in the code, we have explicitly created the facilities to encourage private players to engage in this co-investment. And so here we had indeed the positive experiences from countries like Spain, Portugal, France, where of course the co-investment actions were to a large extent also triggered by national legislation. But we see quite a varied landscape with lots of cooperation agreements. And as you know, Article 76 of the code, already mentioned by Marc, greatly facilitates this joint investment in very high capacity networks. So what is important there, I would say, is that for the regulatory context, it's quite a new concept in the sense that if S&P players would like to avoid being faced with the mandatory conditions that are imposed on them because of their significant market power, they can team up with other co-investors. They can notify that to the regulator. And then we have something called a market test, which resembles very much what is done in the competition context, where market players are being consulted. And then indeed issues whether there will be sufficient downstream competition, whether there will be equal treatment of the co-investors, whether there will be sufficient access to the legacy systems, will be assessed by the national regulator, who will then, when the regulator is satisfied, in principle declare the conditions of the co-investment binding, after having notified them to the Commission and seeking the Commission's view. So elements that are important is that, for instance, one of the explicit goals of co-investment should still be to ensure sufficient competition downstream. So this is not a recipe for if you can't beat your competitor, join it and then subsequently operate as a tandem. But it is really also aimed at providing consumers and access seekers with more competition instead of less. So this is then the co-investment structure in the code. Of course, there's always the possibility of an ex post assessment under the competition rules. And we have seen cases, for instance, in Germany and Italy, where this is carried out. So that's the co-investment context. And then just a few words about network sharing. Of course, an equally interesting topic on which I have spent in the past quite some energy. So there, I would say, very important, I think, both from the competition perspective and from the regulatory perspective, there's a very positive approach from the Commission towards network sharing. We see that indeed as a potential solution also in particular for not densely populated areas. And so in that sense, you can, for instance, find in the connectivity toolbox an explicit recognition of the positive effects of network sharing and also an encouragement of member states to make sure that their operators engage in such cooperations. Now, I noted down, so in this sense, of course, also equally important that afterwards, ex post, there can be a competition analysis. And for the audience, I mean, it's no longer my area, but it may be interesting to signal that DG Competition has just a fortnight ago published a market test, actually, with respect to commitments that the operators in the Czech Republic have offered under the competition rules to make changes in their network sharing arrangements, after which normally the Commission would, if the market test has a positive outcome, declare such commitments binding and close the competition case. So it's interesting to see that this market test focuses on elements that Marc and also Kai Uwe were signaling, like information sharing. Is there a hold-up issue? In this case, there was old technology on one side of the country, new technology on the other side of the country. And this had a negative outcome for consumers. So the parties have committed to modernize the technology on both sides of the country. And also the financial incentives of the parties were closely analyzed in that case. So I think, well, in that sense, maybe the last issue that was raised by Kai Uwe, and I think indirectly also by Marc, does this call for guidance? And we know that already for a number of years, and certainly in the context of the need to accelerate the rollout of very high capacity networks, there was this call for guidance. I think one question that always comes up is, if you want to give guidance, would we, from the Commission's side, already have sufficient experience in the analysis of such agreements? Well, I think we are slowly getting there, but it's a genuine question. And of course, also to be still a little bit on the prudent side, one should perhaps say, be careful what you wish for, because if operators really want to have guidance, they may also get to hear what they are not allowed to do, and that may not particularly what they are aiming for. So long enough, I leave it to this and then hand over to you again.
Thank you so much, Rita, and thank you for accepting our invitation again. It's been great to hear your update and full context and reactions to Pilar's interview too, and aware we've already started on the wider context, but we'll get a bit more on that too, hopefully, if we have time. So thank you so much. And Michelle, thank you so much for being here. In particular, I appreciate what a busy season it is for BEREC, which you're currently sharing. So extremely grateful you took time for CERRE, and it will add a lot here. And perhaps in the interests of time too, of course, we're very interested in your reaction to Marc's report, but also we need to hear from you about the guidelines, of course, that Rita referred to, that BEREC published in December 2020, which actually from a CERRE perspective was subsequent to our lengthier research piece from last year, but on this topic that we're dealing with today. And guidelines, of course, being to foster the consistent application of Article 76. So critical for today's debate. Could you perhaps, as well as your comments on Marc's work, talk us through those guidelines and perhaps on a word on the process it took BEREC to get there? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Laura, and Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to CERRE for the kind invitations, and congratulations to you, Marc, on your continued effort on studying the impacts of co-investment and infrastructure sharing on diverse aspects such as retail prices, network coverage, competition, and so on. And I'd like to seize the opportunity to address some of the aspects mentioned in this paper, of course, as requested. So Digital Decade has set ambitious goal for Europe, as Rita mentioned, as a whole, and BEREC stands fully by those targets, of course. At a time where the deployments of very high capacity networks quite often cooperation between firms, a clear balance between investment incentive in the deployment of these very high capacity networks through cooperation and competition safeguards should be targeted. So through my contacts during this year, I sometimes have the impression that some stakeholders would just prefer that institutional bodies only focus on one objective, being the rollout of the very high capacity networks, all the while forfeiting the other objective, which is competition. And of course, as Caio mentioned, there is no trade-off. It is more subtle than that, but I come to this later. So BEREC still stands by its position that infrastructure-based competition remains the most powerful form of competition for networks, and it should be promoted when and where it is possible. Passive access may be seen as the access form closest to infrastructure competition, of course. So to what extent active or virtual forms of access using network function, virtualizing software-defined networks may really constitute substitutes to passive access. This is a question for NRA to solve on a case-by-case, and taking notably into account the capacity of innovation and the level of independence that they leave to access seekers. So now with regards to co-investment and infrastructure sharing, just let me remind you that BEREC has no preference whatsoever for any particular model of organization. We just want very high capacity networks investment and a lot of it. And this is while preserving sufficient competition, of course. So as you mentioned, Lara, BEREC adopted a common position on mobile infrastructure sharing in 2019, and later BEREC focused on guidelines on co-investments, and it is predominant rollout model in Europe. And we developed that last year, as you mentioned. So of particular importance for BEREC there is the ability of other co-investors to compete effectively and sustainably in the long term on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. So each arrangement or situation will have to be examined on a case-by-case basis and on its own merits. You know that remedies such as access and price regulations that are brought forward as solutions to possible anti-competitive behavior have always been part of our regulatory competencies, as regulators. So in essence, the current framework, as foreseen by the European Electronic Communications Code, enables both co-investment and infrastructure sharing, resulting in a wide deployment and a sustainable, competitive environment. Now, back on the guidelines. So, indeed, we have been tasked. BEREC has been tasked to publish those guidelines to foster the consistent application by the NRAs of the condition to be met when assessing co-investment offers in a new very high capacity networks element. And this Article 76 of the codes contains different aspects to be analyzed by regulators. We have the first subparagraph demanding guidance on what constitutes a new very high capacity network and which type of co-investment model can exist. And a second subparagraph lays conditions to be analyzed by the NRAs with regard to co-investment offer itself, such as the openness of their offer, who can apply, when, and for how long is the offer still open, and also whether the offer was published in a timely manner, allowing interested parties to sufficiently investigate the offers and also related competitions aspects. So this competition analysis can be split into two separate parts. The first part pertains to co-investors, whereas the second part pertains to access seekers who are not co-investors. Co-investors should be able to compete on the downstream markets under fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms, as I mentioned, allowing access to the full capacity of the network to the extent that it is subject to co-investment. So any later increase in participation in the future, reciprocal rights and flexibility in other co-investors are other aspects to be analyzed. Now, access seekers. So access to the very high capacity networks element has to be provided at a time which appropriately reflect the degree of risks. So different factors of adaptation mechanisms such as timing, pricing, quality, mainly speed, are possible. And this depending on the risk incurred and the retail market developments. In other words, non-discrimination applies among access seekers, but not necessarily between co-investors and access seekers. The higher the risk, the longer co-investors may be allowed to benefit from a first mover advantage, or the higher the whole access price they can set, or the higher the speed they can offer. So the NRAs should review the access conditions and the adaptation mechanisms periodically, at least every 5 years, and this is a comparable time frame as set for market analysis. So because of the timing constraint, elaborating all these guidelines of these elements would bring me too far, so just leave me just two more minutes to touch upon some straightforward example. These guidelines are about new very high capacity in deployment, but what is new? Well, in general, BEREC states that these are very high capacity network deployments that have been announced or have been substantially altered after the code entered into force in December 2018, with some exceptions. Also, the term very high capacity in itself needs some explanation. For this, BEREC trusts its guidelines on very high capacity networks that established in 2020 as well. This means that an investment consisting of a deployment of an optical fiber to the end user's premises is likely to qualify under Article 76 of the code, and on the other hand, upgrades or renovations of existing physical infrastructure are more likely excluded, even when such upgrades or renovation are undertaken for the specific purpose of deploying a very high capacity network. Third element, BEREC considers that at least the following co-investment models are well a possible combination of these may be able to qualify as co-investment under this Article 76, joint venture, reciprocal access, and one-way access. Marc referred to this in this presentation. What is underpinning these models is the structural nature of the agreements, which is described in recital 198 of the code. This notion of structural nature, however, excludes commercial access agreements that are limited to rental of capacity. Nevertheless, I reiterate that the description of the three models does not exclude that other, a little more exotic agreements could also qualify as co-investment. And however, the structural nature of this agreement needs to be demonstrated extensively. So for the sake of the time, for more details about the condition of the offer to be analyzed, and especially the elements about the fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms allowing access to the full capacity of the network to the extent that it is subject to co-investment, I have to leave it here and to refer to our guidelines. Over to you, Lara.
Thank you so much, Michelle, because of course the guidelines are a critical part of the key we have here, even though they of course complement the code. So it's great to hear more about them and how Beret got there and how you interpret the guidelines too. I mean, Rita mentioned there being careful what we wish for with guidelines. And of course, I know that guidelines and a case-by-case approach, as has come up in a few interventions, are not necessarily mutually exclusive things. And with that in mind, I'd like to take a question that has come in from viewers on the Slido, and it's a difficult question. We don't shy away from those here at CERRE, but understand that some of you may be in more of a position to comment than others. So this question is from Vodafone, who say that co-investment is already a reality. Pilar del Castillo mentioned too that it's already a reality. In Italy, the co-investment offer by TIM under Article 76 doesn't seem to fulfill its main provisions if we think of deployment of new VHCN in less economically advantageous areas, transparency or openness. What would then justify a regulatory relief for the SMP operator? So a question from a particular point of view. Maybe Kaiue, I'll come to you first on this, and then if any other speaker would like to comment, please let me know. Thank you.
I'm not 100% sure what is meant by some of the claims, because of course what you have in Italy is that a large or most areas are not provided with investments now. Certainly there's a whole area that are white areas which are probably not meant by less economic advantages areas because they're basically taken out, and it's because no one is expected to invest there by themselves. So there were tenders on this under government support. There's certainly the offer, as far as I understand it, is fully also for gray areas in which only one operator is supposed to be or expected to be entering the market. So that would certainly qualify as that. And I'm not sure what's meant with not transparent. It was relatively clear to me what the things are, but maybe I know more. But also kind of the issue of openness here is that I think on that particular offer, it's open to anyone who applies, but it also has, I think, and that's a really important element of the competitiveness of the competitive side. Namely, there's a lot of flexibilities with the type of co-investments that you can make that would fit different types of risk profiles. And that's precisely also the way that you would actually diversify risk in a much broader way. So I think in all of those elements, it's trying to actually follow very much what the BEREC guidelines have been suggesting. And in that sense, a lot of flexibility for also smaller co-investors to actually participate. So I'm not quite following the question, but maybe that would involve a more detailed discussion than we can have here.
Thank you very much, Kaiue. I'll take another question now, and then as I come to speakers, if you'd like to comment on the previous one, please do go ahead. There's a question here about the counterfactual, which I'd like to pose to Marc in the first instance, of course, and it's from Carlos Soto. So is the correct counterfactual sharing versus not sharing, as you mentioned in your presentation, or is it different levels of sharing that have different short and long-term effects on competition? Marc, if I can come to you first on this, thank you.
Okay, so the short answer is that that there is both effects, so there are both questions at play. So first, to understand what are the possible positive and negative effects of a sharing agreement, you need to ask yourself what would be the counterfactual, that is what would happen without sharing. So maybe, I don't know, let's say on the negative side, maybe there would be investment without sharing, and maybe sharing is going to reduce the amount of investment, which would be bad news. But on the positive side, there could be also a situation where without sharing, there would not be any investments. And therefore here sharing fix a kind of market failure in a sense. And on top of that, there is this question of different levels of sharing that may have different effects, both pro-competitive and anti-competitive effects. And usually there is a correlation between the two. So usually, for example, to make things more concrete, so in mobile, passive sharing is considered as something acceptable, which raises no strong concerns for competition. But at the same time, the cost savings that can be expected with passive sharing are more limited than they would be with an active kind of sharing agreement. And so you have less concerns, less potential for harm to competition, but at the same time, less benefits. So I think these are two different questions.
Thank you, Marc. I think that's clearly explained. So thank you very much. I mean, what I thought is on this counterfactual point, it might be worth coming to Rita too, also because Rita, another question has come in addressed to you. Ms. Wezenbeek refers to a recent market test. Does the test address only the relation between the sharers or also between the latter and other competitors? So I don't know if you have views on both those questions, appreciating also that you are now at DG Connect rather than DG Connect.
Yes, indeed. So indeed, and in a way it's my fault because I refer to the market test published by the colleagues from DG Com, but indeed, basically they would of course be best placed to answer questions on that market test. I mean, what I can say is, well, it's a published market test, and in this case, the market test primarily addresses the situation between the operators, because it's there where DG Comp has identified that there was a reduced competition, reduced incentives to invest, and so the remedies basically that the parties are proposing primarily address the situation among themselves. However, in that sense, it's a good maybe also reason to highlight the difference between the market test under the Article 76 and this market test. And the market under Article 76, so the regulatory market test. I mean, there are clearly issues on, I mean, is there decent access? Is there an open offer to co-investors? Indeed, is there transparency? So I think the structure of that market test focuses more on what's the effect of what is being proposed to the other market players, indeed. But obviously, competition law in the end is always about the effects also on the market. So equally addressing effects for consumers and for other companies.
Thank you, Rita. And as so often with tech, media, telecom topics, we're definitely now in an era, if you like, where competition and regulation very much intersect. And that's absolutely the spirit in which we're discussing co-investment today too. But I would like to now, if possible, go forward, if we will, and widen this out as we already have been doing, because I think we're very aware at CERRE that this might at first appear a very specific topic if we think of the European project at large. But as per the introduction, I mean, infrastructure, security, resilience, connectivity, and connectivity as the very essence of the code, as Pilar del Castillo concludes in her interview. All these themes have been absolutely spotlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, where the situation is still evolving, the advent of increased home working and so forth. And the Commission, of course, has given a big focus that will span the rest of its current mandate on recovery and therefore impact on all of our thinking in this policy area. So we've already talked about the digital decade targets to some extent and recovery funds, which Ms. del Castillo also gave a view on in terms of how she considered member states are spending them. So Rita, it'll be great to hear from you there. Michelle, of course, BEREC and BIPT will have a wider program of activity and how we might see the role monitoring transposition progress and implementing the code and the big picture. And Cayuve, of course, within the economist discipline, we always think of the big picture as well as a specific issue. So it would be really great to hear something from you all on the bigger picture in which co-investment sits. And then after this, I think we give the last word to Marc on his takeaways from the panel for closing already. So maybe Rita, I'll come back to you first, given as you spoke already a bit about the digital decade and where we're heading there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so indeed, Pilar, what were the words that she was using? Connectivity is the core of the code, and I think she also mentioned the core of the digital decade targets. I would agree. It's in a way a conditio sine qua non. We have identified many targets in the area of cloud computing, edge computing, high performance computing, data spaces. And all of them are very much dependent on whether the right networks, the powerful enough networks are in place. So the targets that have been identified, I mean, we are now discussing them with the member states. And we can already see also in society at large, there are those who find the targets too ambitious, and there are those who find the targets not ambitious enough. This is normally a sign that the Commission finds the right place, but so we have carefully looked at trends and developments, and we do think that if we see things developing, for instance, the meeting that we now have should in 10 years be a meeting in which we can use virtual reality and we can stand in one room, although we sit in many places at the same time. So these things are evolving. We think that gigabit connectivity is a requirement to do that. So we think these are the right targets. Also, actually, for the more remote areas. And there, for instance, now with respect to, I mean, what should we in particular require member states to invest in or to fulfill in terms of requirements when they are going for state aid? I mean, one consideration is we can, of course, be not very ambitious and say, well, if you only upgrade them a little bit in the remote areas, this is already quite something well serving the citizens there. But that, of course, has a risk that those citizens will, in the long run, not have the gigabit connectivity that would really allow them to be connected to the rest of the country, the rest of the European Union, and also to have the, let's say, industrial and economic life that would actually help them to also enjoy the prosperity that is elsewhere. So very important to have these targets, to also, in the context of the wider policy of the Commission, stimulate that we actually reach those targets. And maybe also to mention in this context, there is European and national funding available to reach the targets. RRF, we're very happy to see that the targets for digital transition are being exceeded, and also that quite a considerable part of those funds used in the context of RRF are allocated to incentivizing and financing the rollout of gigabit connectivity networks. So let me stop at that.
Thank you, Rita. Michelle, how about you?
Thank you very much, Lara. Needless to say that BEREC fully supports the digital decade's targets, and there is also a need for regulators to help achieve these targets while balancing the other objectives of the code, being the promotion of competition and user protection and so on. That's important too to be mentioned. That's it. Promoting the objectives of full connectivity and the digital compass are very high on the agenda of regulatory authorities as well. There is a high degree of awareness for promoting connectivity, and this especially since the pandemic, as Rita mentioned, is. But let me also remind you that the key policy objective for the coming 5 years for BEREC is promoting full connectivity and incentivize investments 5G and fiber in the EU, because we know that the fast rollout of fiber networks and 5G networks, this is a prerequisite for the long-term competitiveness and sustainability of the EU. 5G, for instance, this is a topic that we will continue monitoring actively, closely as the market develops. We have focused and we will continue to focus on issues related to 5G rollouts, such as coverage indicators, but also electromagnetic fields problematic, and also a little less visible aspects such as backhaul and copper switch off, which are topics also relevant for fixed network deployment. As a concrete example of the work we have done so far, we have contributed to, during the last month, to the development of a European connectivity toolbox that will help member states to develop national digital agendas and broadband plans in a manner that's be future-proof, taking into account the green and digital transformation. Important to say also that, well, I try to phrase that way, measuring is knowing, so that's why benchmarks are so important for member states to improve the ranking in DESI index, for instance. This provides a good incentive, and BEREC can assist the European Commission with the monitoring mechanism proposed by the European Commission about what they call the annual state of the digital decade, because we have in BEREC a lot of experience in gathering statistics and ensuring that it is done in a harmonized manner across Europe. But of course, what's important for us too, in this context of rapid technological change and growing importance of the end-to-end connectivity, it is vital that our regulatory practices remain fit for purpose. And so to this end, and just to tell something about next year's program, we will continue to analyze those technological developments and their impact on sustainable competition. In our 2020 work program, we will also cover a wide range of developments ranging from new business models in 5G, the use of satellite, Open RAN, and from the role of fiber in backhaul to copper switch-offs and strategy. And I will stop here, Lara. Over to you.
Thank you, Michel. I mean, that's a varied and busy program indeed. So we'll look forward to seeing those outputs. Kaiue, I must give you a word on the bigger picture too.
Yeah, I think my bigger picture is kind of in a different direction on this, and has more to do with distributional aspects. I think kind of some of our biggest problems that we have, both politically and economically, is an increasing divergence between less populated, more populated areas overall. And I think especially in communications that comes out quite a lot. That is, the more these developments become important, the more there's a danger really that the supplies in densely populated areas diverge, and therefore also the opportunities greatly diverge. And we know that also has a reason, because the costs are enormously different. What we can guarantee in terms of competition in less and more densely populated areas are different. And so, especially in some areas, there is public intervention needed to even have these. And so I think one of the big topics that I haven't heard discussed in this context, but I think is particularly important, is how we actually deal with that public intervention in the less densely populated areas, how we're dealing with public procurement, because I think across the board we've had difficulties with public procurement in terms of cost overruns and delays. And I think that is really one of the things we have to think really hard how to improve the incentive properties there, because it's one of the big areas in which societal problems come from, and they would only be intensified by not solving those types of problems. So for me, that's kind of a very high order issue that from a big picture is really important, and that we probably should discuss more.
Thank you so much, Kaiue. I was going to now hand over to Marc for last word before concluding, but I think we might squeeze in a very short word, seeing as we are talking about the intersection here between regulation and competition. There is a press question here from Matthew Newman at MLX to Rita, asking whether it's possible on the topic of guidelines for the European Commission to have guidelines for network sharing within the horizontal block exemption regulation. I mean, Rita, maybe just a very quick word on whether this is something under consideration as far as you're aware, and then we'll hand over to Marc and close. Thank you.
Yes, again, I think all the questions I have to respond by, this is primarily an issue for DG Comp. And I would actually personally not know exactly where the Commission, DG Comp, is in its reflection. Maybe to note that, of course, there is a chapter in the existing horizontal guidelines, which is called production sharing, which is always used as a framework of analysis, also for network sharing. And now that the horizontal guidelines are being reviewed, I would expect that also there, the sort of more up-to-date views will be developed with respect to this production sharing. Now, nothing is, of course, impossible, but I know that also some of the operators have argued for explicitly including network sharing in horizontal guidelines. But for now, the reflection is still going on. So I would honestly not know how this will in the end play out.
Thank you for your patience with taking that, Rita. I think it is important to mention some of the other pieces which discuss network sharing. So I thought that was worth taking, even if briefly, and thank you again. Marc, I think we must hand over to you. Thanks again for putting together this paper for us. And what are your final thoughts on all the inputs you've heard today, the debate, the questions coming in? Definitely over to you for a substantive wrap up before I close the session. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Lara. So I think, my one takeaway that I have from today is that we, as Rita and Michel have said, is that we should keep in mind what is a key question today, that is, what is the fastest path to widespread connectivity while maintaining a competitive environment. And so I think, looking at this question, in the past, what's proved very effective for the rollout of new network technologies and for having a competitive environment in telecoms is the development of the so-called infrastructure-based competition model. So I think it's important also to continue stimulating infrastructure-based competition, facilitating this form of competition, for example, through access to passive network elements such as docks and poles. So, of course, infrastructure sharing may foster network deployment, but in a sense, it may come at the cost of reduced infrastructure-based competition. So I think also what is important is that the scope of this kind of agreements is well adapted to the competitive environment, with an effort being made to ensure that infrastructure-based competition is maintained. Okay, thank you.
Thank you again, Marc. Well, and thanks to all our panel. It's been great to see co-investment brought to life, truly, really, as we talk rural versus urban contexts and the intersection of regulation, competition, and investment. As I've said at other CERRE events too, I think it's always satisfying when we see continuity to our work in the form of work streams or updates, as this paper is a key example of, because no regulatory issue is ever static, and in particular not with the ambition, as Marc just restated there, of having widespread or let's say near ubiquitous connectivity as we can in the context of the digital decade. I mean, I find this a question of accessibility, equality, and many of the broader values underpinning European regulation, not to mention, of course, crucial business prerogatives. So CERRE will continue to think about these questions. Our next events will be to launch our upcoming publications around ride-hailing, also institutional design, centralized versus decentralized enforcement, cooperation among regulators, which we've seen in action to a degree today. Dates for these events are still to be confirmed. And of course, you can receive prompt updates by signing up to our free newsletter via our website, cerre.eu. That's it. I think it's time to close. So thank you so much to Kayuwe Kuhn, Rita Wezenbeek, and Michel van Bellingen for joining us today. We always welcome feedback and input on our work. Thank you also, by the way, I mustn't forget Pilar del Castillo and her team for making the interview happen. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we look forward to reconvening soon. Have a very good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.